Marcus "Hawk" Davidson adjusted his helmet as the F-22 Raptor's engines hummed beneath him on the tarmac at Nellis Air Force Base. The desert heat shimmered off the runway, but inside the cockpit, everything was cool precision. Today's mission was routine air superiority training over the Nevada test range, but nothing about flying an F-22 ever felt routine to Marcus. Even after 8 years in the cockpit, the raw power of America's most advanced fighter jet still sent electricity through his veins. His wingman, Captain Jake "Viper" Morrison, taxied alongside him. Through the radio, Jake's voice crackled with anticipation. "Ready to show these new hotshots how it's done, Hawk." Marcus smiled behind his oxygen mask. "Always, Viper, let's take her up." The tower cleared them for takeoff, and Marcus felt the familiar surge as the Pratt and Whitney engines roared to life. The F-22 accelerated down the runway with devastating force, and within seconds, they were airborne, climbing rapidly into the crystal-clear Nevada sky. The landscape below shrunk to miniature scale as they ascended to their designated altitude of 35,000 feet. Flight lead, this is Hawk 1. Entering training airspace now, Marcus reported to ground control. "Copy that, Hawk 1. You're cleared for training operations. Weather is optimal, visibility unlimited." Marcus loved this part of the job. Up here, above the clouds, with nothing but blue sky and the horizon stretching endlessly in every direction, all the mundane concerns of base life melted away. The politics, the paperwork, the endless briefings, none of it mattered when you were strapped into $44 million worth of cutting-edge aviation technology. The training scenario called for simulated air-to-air combat, with a group of F-16 Fighting Falcons playing the role of enemy aircraft. Marcus and Jake were to intercept and neutralize the threat using beyond visual range tactics, showcasing the F-22's superior stealth capabilities and advanced radar systems. "Hawk 1, I've got multiple contacts bearing 090, approximately 50 miles out." Jake's voice came through the comm. Marcus checked his displays. The F-22's AN/APG-77 radar system was painting a clear picture of the incoming F-16s. "Confirmed, Viper. I count 4 bandits flying in formation. Let's split up and engage from different vectors." "Roger that, breaking left." Marcus watched Jake's aircraft bank smoothly to the left while he maintained his heading. The beauty of the F-22 was its ability to engage multiple targets simultaneously, while remaining virtually invisible to enemy radar. These F-16 pilots were skilled, but they were flying older technology against the most advanced air superiority fighter ever built. "Hawk 1, you're cleared to engage," came the voice from the airborne warning and control system aircraft monitoring the exercise. Marcus lined up his first target, thumb hovering over the simulated weapon release button. In real combat, he'd be firing AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles from beyond visual range, taking out enemy aircraft before they even knew he was there. Today, it was all electronic warfare, but the adrenaline was just as real. Fox 3, Marcus called out, indicating a simulated missile launch. Splash 1 Bandit. The training exercise continued for another hour, with Marcus and Jake systematically defeating wave after wave of simulated enemy aircraft. When it was over, they formed up for the return flight to Nellie's. "Not bad for a day's work," Jake said over the radio. "Those F-16 guys never knew what hit them." Marcus agreed, but something was nagging at him. As they descended through 20,000 feet, he found himself staring out at the desert landscape below. The Nevada test range stretched out like a moonscape, scarred by decades of weapons testing and military exercises. Somewhere down there, hidden among the countless craters and abandoned test sites, was a piece of his past he'd tried to forget. 5 years ago, before he'd earned his wings on the F-22, Marcus had been a different man. Fresh out of the Air Force Academy, full of idealism and eager to serve his country. He'd been assigned to a classified program that he still couldn't talk about, even to his closest friends. The program had ended badly, with accusations and investigations that nearly destroyed his career before it began. The official story was that the program had been canceled due to budget constraints. Marcus knew better. He'd seen things that weren't supposed to exist, been ordered to participate in operations that violated international law, and when he tried to speak up, he'd been silenced. The only reason he still had a career was because of a sympathetic colonel who'd managed to transfer him to flight training before the bureaucratic axe fell. But Marcus had left something behind in the desert, something that, if discovered, would prove everything he'd been trying to tell his superiors. He'd buried it deep, marked the location with a simple cairn of stones, and prayed that someday someone would find it and expose the truth. Now, flying over that same desert at 30,000 feet, Marcus felt the weight of that buried secret pressing down on him like the G-forces of a high-speed turn. He'd made peace with his decision to stay quiet, to focus on becoming the best pilot he could be. But the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you tried to bury it. Hawk 1, Nellie's Tower. You're cleared for landing on runway 21 left. Roger, Nellie's Tower. Hawk 1 inbound. Marcus pushed the memories aside and focused on the approach. The F-22 touched down with barely a whisper, its advanced landing systems making the 30-ton aircraft feel as light as a feather. As he taxied to the maintenance hangar, Marcus tried to convince himself that the past was the past. He was a different man now, flying the most advanced fighter jet in the world, respected by his peers and trusted by his commanders. But deep in the Nevada desert, buried beneath tons of sand and rock, the truth was waiting. The debriefing session lasted 2 hours. Marcus and Jake sat in a sterile conference room with intelligence officers and flight instructors, reviewing every aspect of the training mission. The F-22's sophisticated computer systems had recorded everything, every maneuver, every simulated weapon launch, every radio transmission. The data would be analyzed for weeks, helping to refine tactics and improve training procedures. "Outstanding work today, gentlemen," said Colonel Patricia Hayes, the squadron commander. "Your engagement efficiency was 96%. The F-16 pilots barely knew you were there until it was too late." Marcus nodded, accepting the praise, but his mind was elsewhere. During the debriefing, they displayed a detailed map of the training area, showing the exact flight paths of all aircraft involved. Marcus had studied that map carefully, noting the coordinates and landmarks. The location where he'd buried his evidence was only 15 miles from their training route, so close he could have seen it if he'd known exactly where to look. "Something on your mind, Hawk?" Colonel Hayes asked, noticing his distraction. "No, ma'am. Just thinking about the tactical scenarios we ran today." "Well, get some rest. We've got another training exercise tomorrow, and I want you and Viper to lead a 4-ship formation against some visiting Navy FA-18s. Should be interesting." Marcus gathered his gear and headed for the locker room. As he changed out of his flight suit, Jake approached him with a concerned expression. "You okay, man? You seemed pretty quiet during the debrief." Marcus considered telling Jake the truth. They'd flown together for 3 years, trusted each other with their lives on a regular basis. If anyone would understand, it would be Jake. But the classified nature of what Marcus had witnessed made it impossible to share, even with his closest friend. "Just tired, I guess. Long day." Jake didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. "Want to grab dinner at the O Club? Sarah's cooking her famous chili tonight." Sarah Coleman was the officers' club manager, a former Air Force sergeant who'd married a pilot and stayed on base after her husband's retirement. Her chili was legendary among the flight crews, and Thursday nights at the O Club were always packed. "Rain check," Marcus said. "I think I'll just head home and crash." "Suit yourself, but you're missing out on the best chili in Nevada." Marcus drove home to his small apartment off base, but he couldn't shake the image of that map from the debriefing. 15 miles. He'd flown over his buried secret without even knowing it. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, piloting the most advanced surveillance aircraft in the world, capable of detecting enemy targets from hundreds of miles away, and he couldn't even locate something he'd buried with his own hands. He spent the evening researching satellite imagery of the Nevada test range, using his military access to examine high-resolution photos of the desert landscape. The test range was vast, covering over 1 million acres of restricted airspace. Finding one small cairn of stones would be like finding a needle in a haystack, especially after 5 years of wind and erosion. But Marcus had to try. The secret he'd buried wasn't just evidence of wrongdoing. It was proof that good people had died because of decisions made by men in suits who'd never set foot in a combat zone. He owed it to those people to tell their story, even if it meant risking his career. As he studied the satellite images, Marcus began to form a plan. Tomorrow's training exercise would take them over a different part of the test range, but he could request a route change, citing tactical considerations. If he could get close enough to the burial site, he might be able to spot the cairn from the air. The F-22's advanced optics and targeting systems could resolve objects as small as a person from miles away. The plan was risky. Any deviation from the assigned flight path would be noted and questioned. But Marcus had built a reputation as a careful, methodical pilot who never took unnecessary chances. If he could come up with a plausible tactical reason for the route change, he might be able to pull it off. He went to bed that night with his mind racing, running through scenarios and contingencies. Tomorrow's flight would either put his past to rest forever, or drag it kicking and screaming into the light. Either way, Marcus Davidson was about to discover that some secrets refuse to stay buried. The alarm went off at 500 hours, but Marcus was already awake, staring at the ceiling and running through his plan one more time. He'd rehearsed the route change request dozens of times, crafting a tactical justification that would sound reasonable to his superiors. The key was to make it seem like a natural evolution of the training scenario, not a desperate attempt to revisit a classified burial site. He arrived at the squadron ready room an hour early, using the time to study weather reports and intelligence briefings. The morning's exercise would pit a 4-ship formation of F-22s against 6 Navy FA-18E Super Hornets from VFA 154. The Black Knights squadron visiting from Naval Air Station Lemoore. It was a rare opportunity for inter-service training, and the Navy pilots were eager to test themselves against the Air Force's premier air superiority fighter. "Morning, Hawk," Jake said as he entered the ready room. "You look like you didn't sleep a wink." "Just excited about tangling with the Navy boys," Marcus replied, forcing a smile. "Think they'll give us a good fight." "The Black Knights are no joke. I flew against them in Red Flag 2 years ago. They're aggressive and well-trained. Should be fun." Lieutenant Colonel Rick Torch Sullivan, the deputy squadron commander, called the briefing to order. The Navy pilots joined them via video link from their temporary quarters at the other end of the base. Marcus studied their faces on the screen, noting the mix of confidence and nervousness that came with facing an unfamiliar opponent. "Gentlemen," Colonel Sullivan began, "today's exercise will test multi-domain air superiority tactics in a contested environment. The F-22s will establish air dominance over the northern sector of the Nevada test range, while the Super Hornets will attempt to penetrate our defensive perimeter and strike simulated ground targets." Marcus raised his hand. "Sir, I'd like to request a minor modification to the planned route." Colonel Sullivan raised an eyebrow. "What did you have in mind, Hawk?" "The current flight path has us entering the training area from the southeast. If we approach from the southwest instead, we can use the terrain masking from the mountain ranges to our advantage. It would give us a better tactical position and more realistic combat scenario." The request was reasonable, well within the parameters of the exercise. Marcus held his breath as Colonel Sullivan considered it. "Makes sense. How does that affect fuel consumption and timing?" Marcus had prepared for this question. "Minimal impact on fuel, sir. Might add 5 minutes to the total flight time, but the tactical advantage would be worth it." "Approved. Update your flight plans accordingly." Marcus felt a surge of relief mixed with apprehension. He'd cleared the first hurdle, but now he actually had to execute the plan. The modified route would take them within 3 miles of the burial site, close enough for the F-22 sensors to detect the cairn, if it was still there after 5 years of desert weather. The pre-flight inspection of his aircraft was routine, but Marcus found himself paying extra attention to the targeting and surveillance systems. The F-22's AN AAQ-27 electro-optical targeting system could track objects as small as a baseball from 20 miles away. If the cairn was still intact, he'd be able to see it. "Hawk 1, you're cleared for taxi," came the voice from ground control. Marcus acknowledged and began the familiar process of taxiing to the runway. His wingman, Captain Lisa Vixen Park, fell in behind him, followed by the other 2 aircraft in their formation. Lisa was one of the few female F-22 pilots, a skilled aviator who'd earned her call sign through aggressive flying and a fierce competitive streak. "Hawk 1, this is Vixen. You seem a little tense today. Everything okay?" Marcus realized he'd been gripping the control stick tighter than usual, just ready to show these Navy pilots what real air superiority looks like. "That's the spirit. Let's go hunting." The takeoff was smooth. 4 F-22s lifting off in sequence and forming up in a loose diamond formation. As they climbed to altitude, Marcus felt the familiar thrill of commanding such an incredible machine. But today, the excitement was tempered by the knowledge that he was about to confront a piece of his past that he'd tried to leave buried in the desert. Hawk Flight, this is Overlord. You're cleared into the training area. Navy flights are approaching from the east, approximately 40 miles out. Roger, Overlord. Hawk Flight acknowledging. Marcus led his formation into the modified approach route, his heart rate increasing as they neared the coordinates he'd memorized. The terrain below was a mixture of rocky outcroppings and sandy washes, dotted with the occasional Joshua tree or sagebrush. To most observers, it would look like empty wasteland. But Marcus knew that somewhere in that seemingly barren landscape was evidence of crimes that had been covered up by men who valued their careers more than human lives. Hawk 1, I'm getting multiple contacts on radar, reported Captain Tom Blade Rodriguez, flying in the number 3 position. Looks like our Navy friends are trying to sneak up on us. Copy that, Blade. Maintain formation and prepare for engagement. Marcus divided his attention between the approaching Navy aircraft and the ground below. The F-22s multifunction displays showed both the tactical situation and the terrain mapping system. He was still 2 miles from the target coordinates, but he could already see the distinctive rock formation that had served as his landmark 5 years ago. Hawk Flight, this is Vixen. I'm seeing some interesting terrain features down there. Looks like old test sites and craters. This place has seen some serious ordnance over the years. Affirmative, Vixen. The Nevada test range has been used for weapons testing since the 1950s. Stay focused on the air-to-air picture. Marcus forced himself to concentrate on the mission as the Navy FA-18s appeared on his radar display. The Super Hornets were flying in a loose formation, trying to use their lower radar cross-section and superior numbers to gain an advantage. It was a classic David versus Goliath scenario, except in this case, David was flying a 4th-generation fighter against a 5th-generation air superiority monster. Hawk 1, recommend we engage the lead element first and force them to break formation, suggested Jake over the radio. Good thinking, Viper. Vixen, you and Blade take the trailing element. We'll handle the leaders. The engagement developed quickly, with both sides maneuvering for position. Marcus found himself in a high-speed chase with a Super Hornet pilot who was clearly skilled and aggressive. The Navy pilot was using every trick in the book, notching to defeat missile shots, using terrain masking to break radar lock, and flying dangerously close to the desert floor to avoid detection. It was during this low-altitude chase that Marcus saw it. A small pile of rocks, bleached white by years of sun and wind, sitting alone in a sandy wash about a mile off their left wing. The cairn was smaller than he remembered, worn down by weather and time, but it was definitely there. Fox 3, Marcus called out, launching a simulated AMRAAM at the fleeing Super Hornet. Splash 1 Bandit. The Navy pilot acknowledged the simulated kill with professional grace, peeling away from the engagement area. But Marcus barely noticed. His attention was fixed on the small pile of stones passing beneath his aircraft. After 5 years of wondering, he'd finally found it again. "Nice shot, Hawk," came the voice of the exercise controller. "That's a confirmed kill on Navy 1. Copy that, Overlord." Hawk 1 continuing to engage remaining bandits. The exercise continued for another 30 minutes, with the F-22s systematically defeating the Navy aircraft using superior stealth and beyond visual range capabilities. But Marcus was operating on autopilot, his mind focused on the implications of what he'd just seen. The cairn was still there, which meant the evidence he'd buried was probably still intact. The question was, what was he going to do about it? The post-flight debriefing was a blur of tactical analysis and performance metrics. Marcus answered questions and provided input when required, but his thoughts kept drifting back to that small pile of stones in the desert. The Navy pilots were gracious in defeat, acknowledging the technological superiority of the F-22 while arguing that in a real-world scenario, they would have used different tactics. "The F-22 is an impressive aircraft," admitted Commander Rick Mako Stevens, the Navy flight leader. "But in a real fight, you wouldn't have the luxury of controlled airspace and predictable enemy behavior." "That's true," Marcus replied. "But that's exactly why we train like this, to prepare for the unexpected and refine our tactics." Colonel Sullivan wrapped up the debrief with praise for both sides. "Outstanding work today, gentlemen. The data from this exercise will be invaluable for future training scenarios. Navy pilots, thank you for making the trip out here. Your participation made this a truly valuable exercise." As the Navy pilots filed out of the briefing room, Jake approached Marcus with a concerned expression. "You sure you're okay? You seemed pretty distracted during the debrief." Marcus realized he needed to be more careful. His behavior was starting to attract attention, and the last thing he needed was questions about his mental state. "Just tired, I guess. These high-intensity exercises take a lot out of you." Jake nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Well, get some rest. We've got another training flight tomorrow, and I need my flight leader sharp." Marcus spent the rest of the day trying to act normal, but his mind kept returning to the cairn. He'd found it, which meant the evidence was still there. But what was he supposed to do with that information? The classified program he'd witnessed had been shut down years ago, and most of the people involved had moved on to other assignments. Bringing up the past now would only destroy his career and accomplish nothing. But as he lay in bed that night, Marcus couldn't shake the faces of the people who died because of that program. They deserved better than to have their sacrifice covered up and forgotten. He'd made a promise to himself 5 years ago that he would eventually tell their story, and now fate had literally put him in a position to do something about it. The next morning brought a surprise. Colonel Hayes called Marcus into her office for what she described as a routine performance review. Marcus suspected it was anything but routine. "Sit down, Hawk," she said, closing the door behind him. "I'll get straight to the point. You've been acting strange lately, and it's starting to worry me." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "Ma'am, I'm not sure what you mean." "Come on, Davidson. I've been watching you for 3 years. You're one of the most focused, professional pilots I've ever worked with. But lately, you seem distracted, almost like you're carrying some kind of burden." Colonel Hayes was perceptive, a quality that had made her an excellent squadron commander. Marcus realized he needed to give her something to satisfy her curiosity without revealing the truth. "I've been thinking about my future, ma'am. Whether I want to stay in the Air Force or transition to civilian life. It's a big decision, and I guess it's been weighing on me." "I see. And what's prompted this career crisis?" Marcus shrugged. "I love flying, but sometimes I wonder if I'm making a real difference. These training exercises are important, but they're not exactly saving lives or protecting freedom." Colonel Hayes leaned back in her chair, studying him carefully. "You know, Hawk, I've seen a lot of pilots go through this kind of existential crisis. The routine of peacetime flying can make you question why you're doing what you're doing. But what you're doing is important, even if it doesn't always feel that way." "Yes, ma'am, I understand that." "Good, because I'd hate to lose one of my best pilots to a case of the blues. If you need to talk to someone, we have resources available. Confidential resources." Marcus nodded, recognizing the offer for what it was. The Air Force had chaplains and counselors available for personnel dealing with stress or personal problems, but his issues couldn't be resolved through traditional channels. "Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate that." "All right, get out of here. And Hawk, whatever's bothering you, don't let it affect your flying. I need you sharp." Marcus left the colonel's office with a new sense of urgency. His behavior was attracting attention, and it was only a matter of time before someone started asking harder questions. He needed to either deal with his buried secret or find a way to put it behind him permanently. That afternoon, he made a decision that would change everything. He requested a meeting with the base legal office, claiming he had questions about a hypothetical legal situation. The young Air Force lawyer, Captain Jennifer Walsh, was happy to provide guidance. Let's say, hypothetically, that someone witnessed illegal activity during a classified program, but was prevented from reporting it through normal channels. Marcus began carefully. What would be the proper way to handle that information years later? Captain Walsh frowned. That's a complex situation. It would depend on the nature of the illegal activity, the classification level involved, and whether statute of limitations issues applied. What if the activity involved violations of international law, war crimes potentially? That's extremely serious. In a hypothetical situation like that, the person would need to consult with someone who has the appropriate security clearance and legal authority to handle classified information. Marcus nodded. And if this person had physical evidence of the wrongdoing? Evidence would be crucial, but it would need to be properly handled and authenticated. Classified evidence can't just be turned over to anyone. Marcus left the legal office with more questions than answers. The conversation had confirmed what he already knew. Dealing with classified information was extremely complicated, and one wrong move could land him in prison for espionage. But as he drove home that evening, passing the perimeter of the Nevada test range, Marcus made a decision. He was going to recover the evidence he'd buried, regardless of the consequences. The people who died in that classified program deserved justice, and he was the only one left who could give it to them. The opportunity came 2 weeks later, during a routine training exercise that would take him over the northern edge of the test range. Marcus had spent the intervening time carefully planning his approach, studying satellite imagery and weather patterns. He would have one chance to land near the burial site, recover the evidence, and take off before anyone noticed his absence. The plan was insane, risky beyond measure, and probably illegal. But Marcus had reached the point where he couldn't live with himself if he didn't try. The morning of the exercise dawned clear and cool, with unlimited visibility and light winds. Perfect flying weather. Marcus went through his pre-flight routine with mechanical precision, checking every system twice. The F-22 was in perfect condition, ready for whatever demands he might place on it. Hawk 1, this is Vixen, ready for another day of showing off for the camera crews. Marcus had forgotten about the media presence. A team of military journalists was filming the exercise for a documentary about air superiority training. The last thing he needed was cameras recording his unauthorized detour. Just remember to smile for the cameras, Vixen. We're representing the entire Air Force today. The training scenario called for a 4-ship formation of F-22s to establish air superiority over a designated area, then provide close air support for simulated ground operations. It was a complex mission that would test both their air-to-air and air-to-ground capabilities. Marcus led his formation into the training area, his heart rate increasing as they approached the coordinates he'd memorized. The burial site was only 5 miles off their planned route, hidden in a small canyon that would provide perfect cover for a quick landing and takeoff. Hawk Flight, this is Overlord. You're cleared to begin the exercise. Ground units are requesting immediate air support in Sector 7. Roger, Overlord. Hawk Flight moving to provide close air support. Marcus made his decision. Vixen, take the lead. I'm having a minor electrical issue and need to run some diagnostics. Copy that, Hawk. Vixen has the lead. It was a plausible excuse that would buy him a few minutes of autonomy. Marcus peeled away from the formation and dove toward the desert floor, using the terrain to mask his approach to the burial site. The canyon was exactly as he remembered it, a narrow gash in the desert floor, invisible from above unless you knew exactly where to look. The F-22 wasn't designed for rough field landings, but Marcus had trained for emergency situations. He touched down on a relatively flat stretch of sand, the aircraft's landing gear sinking slightly into the soft surface. The engines continued to run as he quickly shut down non-essential systems and prepared for a rapid departure. Marcus climbed out of the cockpit, his boots hitting the desert sand with a soft thud. The silence was profound after the constant noise of the aircraft. He'd forgotten how quiet the desert could be, broken only by the distant whistle of wind through the rocks. The cairn was exactly where he'd left it, 30 yards from the aircraft. Marcus ran to it, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. He began pulling away the carefully placed stones, revealing the metal ammunition box he'd buried 5 years ago. The desert had been kind to it. The box was weathered but intact, its contents protected from the elements. Inside the box was a collection of documents, photographs, and digital storage devices that proved the existence of the classified program and documented the illegal activities he'd witnessed. There were after-action reports describing operations that violated the Geneva Convention, photographs of prohibited weapons being tested on human subjects, and recorded conversations between senior officers discussing the cover-up. Marcus had risked everything to preserve this evidence, and now he was risking everything again to recover it. But as he held the box in his hands, he knew he'd made the right choice. The truth was too important to leave buried in the desert. Hawk 1, this is Overlord. What's your status? Marcus keyed his radio. Overlord Hawk 1, diagnostics complete, rejoining the formation now. He secured the ammunition box in the F-22's small storage compartment and climbed back into the cockpit. The engines spooled up quickly, and within minutes, he was airborne again, climbing back to altitude to rejoin his formation. The entire detour had taken less than 10 minutes, but those 10 minutes had changed everything. Hawk 1, this is Vixen. Good to have you back. We've been having all the fun without you. Copy that, Vixen. What's the tactical situation? Marcus forced himself to focus on the exercise, but his mind kept drifting to the box secured in his aircraft. He'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and now he had to decide what to do with the evidence he'd recovered. The exercise continued for another hour, with Marcus performing his duties with professional competence while his world turned upside down. When they finally returned to base, he felt like he was landing in a completely different reality than the one he'd left that morning. The post-flight debriefing seemed to last forever. Marcus answered questions and provided input while the ammunition box sat in his aircraft, a ticking time bomb that could destroy his career and possibly land him in prison. But it could also expose the truth about crimes that had been covered up for far too long. After the debriefing, Marcus retrieved the box from his aircraft and took it home. He spent the evening reviewing the contents, reliving memories he'd tried to suppress. The documents painted a picture of systematic abuse and cover-up that went all the way to the highest levels of command. People had died, and their deaths had been covered up to protect the careers of men who valued their own advancement over human life. The next morning, Marcus made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He contacted a journalist he'd researched carefully, someone with experience covering military scandals and the security clearance necessary to handle classified information. The conversation was brief and carefully worded, but the message was clear. Marcus had a story to tell, and he was finally ready to tell it. 3 days later, Marcus sat in a secure conference room at the Pentagon, facing a panel of senior officers and civilian officials. The journalist had done his job well, presenting the evidence to the appropriate authorities and demanding a full investigation. Marcus had been granted whistleblower protection, but he knew his military career was effectively over. "Captain Davidson," said the general leading the panel, "these are very serious allegations you're making. Are you prepared to testify under oath about what you witnessed?" Marcus looked around the room at the faces of men and women who would decide his fate. Some looked skeptical, others appeared genuinely concerned. All of them represented a system that had failed the people who died in that classified program. "Yes, sir. I'm prepared to tell the truth, regardless of the consequences." And for the first time in 5 years, Marcus felt truly free. The investigation that followed was extensive and thorough. Marcus testified for hours, providing detailed accounts of what he'd witnessed and explaining how he'd preserved the evidence. Other witnesses came forward, people who'd been afraid to speak up before but found courage in Marcus's example. The scandal that emerged was even worse than Marcus had imagined. The classified program had been a rogue operation, conducted without proper oversight or authorization. Senior officers had covered up war crimes, falsified reports, and destroyed evidence to protect their careers. The people who died had been victims of illegal human experimentation, their sacrifice hidden behind layers of classification and bureaucracy. Marcus's military career was indeed over, but not in the way he'd expected. Rather than being court-martialed or discharged in disgrace, he was quietly transferred to a staff position while the investigation continued. The Air Force wanted to keep him close, partly to protect him from retaliation, and partly to ensure his continued cooperation. The story eventually broke in the media, despite efforts to keep it classified. The journalist who'd helped Marcus had done his job well, building a case that was too solid to ignore or suppress. Public outrage forced congressional hearings, and several senior officers were eventually court-martialed and convicted. Marcus testified before Congress, telling his story to a national audience. The C-SPAN cameras captured every word as he described the crimes he'd witnessed and the cover-up that had followed. It was a moment of truth that had been 5 years in the making. "Captain Davidson," asked the committee chairman, "what would you say to other service members who might be witnessing wrongdoing but are afraid to come forward?" Marcus looked directly into the camera, knowing that his words would be heard by thousands of men and women in uniform. "I would say that our oath is to the Constitution and to the American people, not to any individual or institution. When we witness wrongdoing, we have a moral obligation to speak up, regardless of the personal cost. The people who died in that program trusted us to do the right thing, and we failed them. We can't bring them back, but we can honor their memory by ensuring that this never happens again." The hearing room erupted in applause, but Marcus barely heard it. His mind was back in the Nevada desert, standing beside a small pile of stones that had marked the location of buried truth. He'd taken a tremendous risk to preserve that evidence, and an even greater risk to recover it. But seeing the faces of the committee members, hearing the applause of the audience, he knew it had been worth it. The aftermath of the scandal was swift and decisive. The officers responsible for the cover-up were prosecuted to the full extent of the law. The families of the victims were finally told the truth about how their loved ones had died, and they received the recognition and compensation they deserved. The classified program was not only shut down, but its very existence was declassified, ensuring that future oversight would prevent similar abuses. Marcus was awarded the Air Force Cross for his courage in exposing the truth, though he privately questioned whether he deserved recognition for simply doing what was right. He retired from the Air Force with full honors, despite being only 32 years old. The stress of the investigation and the weight of what he'd witnessed had taken their toll, and he was ready for a new chapter in his life. But the story didn't end there. Marcus used his experience to become an advocate for military whistleblowers, helping other service members who found themselves in similar situations. He testified before Congress on military justice reform, worked with veterans organizations to support those who'd been wronged by the system, and spoke at military academies about the importance of moral courage. The small pile of stones in the Nevada desert had been scattered by the wind and weather, but the truth it had marked had finally been told. Marcus often thought about that moment when he'd spotted the cairn from 30,000 feet, flying the most advanced fighter jet in the world. It was a reminder that sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones we make about ourselves. Years later, Marcus would return to Nevada as a civilian contractor, working with the Air Force to develop new training protocols that emphasized ethical decision-making alongside tactical proficiency. He never flew an F-22 again, but he often found himself looking up at the contrails of the fighters practicing overhead, remembering the weight of the stick in his hands and the moment when he'd chosen truth over career. The investigation had revealed that Marcus wasn't the only one who tried to speak up about the classified program. Several other personnel had attempted to report the illegal activities through official channels, only to be silenced or transferred. Their stories emerged during the hearings, painting a picture of systematic suppression that had enabled the crimes to continue for years. Dr. Rebecca Martinez had been an Air Force medical officer assigned to the program. She documented the medical experiments being conducted on prisoners and had tried to report them to her superiors. Instead of investigating her concerns, they transferred her to a remote base in Alaska and threatened her with court-martial if she continued to make unfounded allegations. Sergeant First Class Michael Thompson had been a security specialist who'd witnessed the disposal of evidence and the falsification of reports. When he tried to report what he'd seen, he'd been accused of mental instability and forced to undergo psychological evaluation. The evaluation had been used to justify his early discharge from the military. These stories, and others like them, demonstrated the culture of intimidation and cover-up that had enabled the crimes to continue. Marcus realized that his decision to preserve evidence and eventually come forward had been part of a larger pattern of moral courage that had been systematically suppressed. The congressional hearings also revealed the extent of the cover-up. High-ranking officers had destroyed documents, intimidated witnesses, and used their authority to silence anyone who threatened to expose the truth. The conspiracy had reached into the highest levels of the Pentagon, implicating generals and civilian officials who had prioritized their careers over their moral obligations. General Patricia Hawkins, who had been the program's senior commander, was convicted of multiple counts of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. During her court-martial, she showed no remorse for her actions, arguing that she had been protecting national security by keeping the program classified. Her defense fell apart when prosecutors presented evidence that she had personally authorized the destruction of evidence and the intimidation of witnesses. Colonel James Richardson, who had been Marcus's immediate supervisor during the program, received a life sentence for his role in the cover-up. He had been the one who'd threatened Marcus with court-martial if he continued to ask questions about the program. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that the man who'd tried to silence him was now spending the rest of his life in prison. The victims of the program were finally given the recognition they deserved. A memorial was erected at Arlington National Cemetery, listing the names of all those who had died during the illegal experiments. Their families were invited to a ceremony where the Secretary of Defense formally apologized for the military's actions and announced a compensation fund for the survivors. Marcus attended the ceremony, standing quietly in the back as the families received the recognition that had been denied to them for so long. He watched as elderly parents accepted flags in memory of children who had died decades earlier, their sacrifice finally acknowledged by the institution that had failed them. After the ceremony, Marcus was approached by Maria Santos, whose son had been one of the victims. She was in her 70s now, her hair white and her hands shaking slightly as she reached out to touch his arm. "Thank you," she said simply. "My son died believing that no one would ever know what happened to him. Because of you, his death finally means something." Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes. "Ma'am, I'm sorry it took so long. I should have done something sooner." "You did what you could when you could do it. That's all any of us can do." The conversation stayed with Marcus for months afterward. He'd spent years feeling guilty about his initial silence, wondering if he could have saved lives by speaking up sooner. But Maria Santos had given him something he'd never expected: forgiveness and understanding. The scandal had far-reaching effects on military culture and policy. New whistleblower protections were enacted, making it easier for service members to report wrongdoing without fear of retaliation. Training programs were implemented to emphasize the importance of moral courage and ethical decision-making. The entire military justice system was reformed to prevent the kind of cover-up that had enabled the crimes to continue. Marcus found himself in demand as a speaker at military installations around the world. He would stand before audiences of young officers and enlisted personnel, telling his story and emphasizing the importance of speaking up when they witnessed wrongdoing. The message was always the same. Their oath was to the Constitution and to the American people, not to any individual or institution. During one of these speaking engagements at the Air Force Academy, a young cadet asked him if he regretted his decision to come forward, given the personal cost he'd paid. Every action has consequences, Marcus replied. I lost my flying career, I lost friends, and I spent years dealing with the stress of what I'd witnessed. But I gained something more valuable, the ability to look at myself in the mirror and know that I did the right thing. The people who died in that program deserved better than silence. They deserved the truth. The cadet nodded, but Marcus could see the uncertainty in his eyes. It was easy to talk about moral courage in a classroom setting, but much harder to exercise it when your career and livelihood were on the line. Let me ask you something, Marcus continued. What's the point of having the most advanced military in the world if we can't trust the people who lead it? What's the point of swearing an oath to defend the Constitution if we're not willing to uphold its values when it's difficult? The question hung in the air as Marcus finished his presentation. He'd learned that there were no easy answers to the moral dilemmas that service members faced, but there were principles that could guide their decisions. The Constitution, the laws of war, and basic human decency provided a framework for ethical behavior, even when institutional pressures pushed in the opposite direction. As Marcus left the academy that day, he thought about the young men and women who would soon become officers in the Air Force. They would face their own moral challenges, their own moments of truth when they had to choose between their careers and their consciences. Some would make the right choice, others would remain silent, and a few might even participate in wrongdoing. But Marcus had faith that his story, and the stories of others like him, would make a difference. The next generation of military leaders would know that moral courage was not just a concept taught in ethics classes, but a practical necessity for maintaining the integrity of the armed forces. The impact of Marcus's actions extended beyond the military. His story became a case study in business schools, law schools, and government agencies, demonstrating the importance of organizational culture and ethical leadership. The scandal he'd exposed had shown how good people could be corrupted by institutional pressure, and how a single individual's courage could expose systematic wrongdoing. Years passed, and Marcus built a new life for himself outside the military. He married a fellow veteran, Sarah Williams, who had served as an Army intelligence officer and understood the unique challenges of military life. They bought a small ranch in Montana, where Marcus could see the mountains in the distance and feel the vast open sky above him. Sometimes, on clear days, he would see the contrails of military aircraft high overhead and remember what it felt like to fly at the edge of space, alone in the cockpit of the most advanced fighter jet ever built. The memories were bittersweet, filled with both the joy of flight and the weight of the secrets he'd carried. But Marcus had made his peace with the past. He'd kept his promise to the people who had died in that classified program, ensuring that their sacrifice was not forgotten. The truth had been told, justice had been served, and the system had been reformed to prevent similar abuses in the future. The small pile of stones in the Nevada desert was long gone, scattered by wind and weather, but the truth it had marked lived on, preserved in congressional records, court transcripts, and the memories of those who had been touched by the scandal. Marcus had learned that some secrets were too important to stay buried, and that the courage to speak truth to power was the foundation of a free society. On quiet evenings, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Marcus would sometimes think about the moment when he'd spotted that cairn from 30,000 feet. It had been a sign from his past, a reminder that the truth always found a way to surface, no matter how deep it was buried. The F-22 Raptor continued to fly, piloted by a new generation of airmen who benefited from the reforms that Marcus's courage had made possible. They flew with the knowledge that their institution valued integrity as much as skill, that moral courage was as important as physical bravery, and that the oath they had sworn was not just words, but a sacred promise to the American people. Marcus had given up his wings to preserve that promise, and in doing so, had found a different kind of flight, the freedom that comes from living in accordance with one's deepest values, regardless of the cost. The signal he had left behind years ago had been more than just a pile of stones marking buried evidence. It had been a testament to the enduring power of truth and the courage required to defend it. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky above his ranch, Marcus Davidson smiled, knowing that he had honored the memory of those who had died and helped ensure that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. The truth was sometimes buried, but it was never really lost. It waited patiently for someone brave enough to dig it up and bring it into the light. The story of Captain Marcus "Hawk" Davidson had ended, but the legacy of his courage would continue to inspire others for generations to come. The signal he had left behind in the Nevada desert had been found, not just by his own eyes from the cockpit of an F-22, but by the countless men and women who would follow his example and choose truth over convenience, justice over career advancement, and moral courage over institutional pressure. In the end, that was the most important flight of Marcus Davidson's career, not the high-altitude intercepts or the precision strikes, but the journey from silence to truth, from complicity to courage, from the desert floor to the heights of moral leadership. He had taken the high line, and in doing so, had shown others the way to follow.